Okay, because we started with a theory, I will go from the other way around. I will start with telling you about our case studies, then say a bit how we kind of conceptualize the theory for the specific case of museum studies, and at the end I will tell you a bit about the methodology or the procedure, how we want to go through. So we have selected 5 World War I and World War II museums in different parts of Europe for our analysis, and the selection criteria were as follows. First, we took only into consideration museums which were established or underwent major reconstruction after 89-90, so kind of after the end of the Cold War, within the kind of process of enlarging the European Union, even if it still took quite some time for the enlargement to happen. We took museums which kind of, it's clear that they address an international public in terms of visitors who come, in terms of languages they operate, and so on. And the third kind of criteria was that they all at least strive or take an effort to tell history of both wars from a, however you would call it, transnational, European or universal perspective, so that it's not only a national take on history they take. And the selected museums are as following. You will know some of them, so I will not talk too much about those. First, it's the Kobarid Museum in Slovenia, which is a museum of the First World War. It was opened by locals in 1990. And the exhibition is devoted to the Socha and Zonzo front between Italians and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it clearly defines itself first as an anti-war museum and also tries to represent all sides of the conflict in a fairly neutral or non-judgmental way. Then we have the Perón Museum. There have been quite some researches made on this museum already. The Historia de la Grande Guerre in Perón, and it was opened only 2 days later, 1992, and it's located at the sites of the battles of Somme and Picardy. And again, here this permanent exhibition tries to narrate, you could say, various truths at war, and visitors are enhanced to look at to relate to French, British, and German soldiers fighting on the different sides of the fronts. Differently to Kobarid, which was set up by, mostly by non-professionals, not historians or not experienced museologists. Here you, as you know, you had from the very beginning on, you had a kind of international team of scientists from those various countries kind of piloting this project. The third case study we have chosen, I don't know if you know this museum, it's the German-Russian museum in Berlin, Karlshorst, which again is a historical site. This is sort of a villa in the suburbs of Berlin where the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany was signed on the 9th of May 1945, and there has been already a museum existing there starting in the 60s, which was set up by the Red Army, by the Soviet Union and the Red Army. It was a Red Army territory in Berlin. It was called the Museum of Unconditional Surrender of Fascist Germany in the Great Patriotic War, and it was clearly a propagandistic museum run by the Red Army and directly foremost to Red Army soldiers stationed in Berlin. And after the German unification, there was a question what will happen with this place, and finally it was decided that there will be still a museum. And it's a quite unique sort of German-Russian cooperation that there is association and members of which are, amongst others, the German and the Russian governments. And also you have a scientific board, which is you have both Russian and German scholars in this board, and it is meant as a symbol of sort of German-Russian reconciliation, and focuses the main exhibition focuses mostly on the German-Soviet War, some of the German aggression on Soviet Union in 1941, and the subsequent War of Annihilation. And it's quite interesting because on one hand, this permanent exhibition strives to present you could say, a coherent historical narrative which would show that that after 70 years now the Germans and the Russians are able to kind of have a common narrative of the war. But on the other hand, the authors of the exhibition, the curators, clearly claim its multi-perspectivity. So this is the question how this functions. The museum, the new museum, was established in 1995, but there has been a major change of the permanent exhibition only 2013. So this is our main point of reference, this new exhibition. The fourth case study is the Oskar Schindler's enamel factory in Krakow. I don't know if you happen to know this. This is a museum which was established as a branch of the Historical Museum in Krakow in 2010. Again, on a historical site of the former factory, enamel factory, which belonged during World War II to Oskar Schindler, and this place became famous after Spielberg's film Schindler's List. But the permanent exhibition doesn't deal really with Schindler, or only to a small part, but it's dedicated to the history of Krakow under German occupation, and it's in that sense unique for Poland that it's the first, until now I think only museum. We'll see what will happen with the World War II museum, which tries to tell first both the history of the Holocaust and of the Jewish inhabitants of Krakow and of the Polish or non-Jewish Catholic inhabitants of Krakow under one roof in one narrative, and also takes in however we would understand it, the German perspective. So the Germans are also their perspective on Krakow at that time is also shown. And then the fifth example we have taken is the Military History Museum of the Bundeswehr in Dresden. It's an old museum which has a long history. Was established as a military museum, German military museum, already in the 19th century, but underwent a major reconstruction in the beginning of the 21st century, and it was reopened 2011 with a totally new exhibition. And you might first wonder why we have chosen this museum, because at the first glance it doesn't fit into this our grid, so to say, because can one imagine anything which would be sort of more, if not nationalistic, but more national, as a German army museum run by the German army, basically. But again, the museum, since its reopening, focuses less on arms and war tactics, but tries to put military history into a broader cultural and political context. And in fact, as the other museums we have chosen, it can be very much described as a rather anti-war museum, and also here multi-perspectivity is a K word for the exhibition, also in all the declarations and self-descriptions of the museum. They claim they are multi-perspectivity. So those are the 5 case studies we have chosen. So what we are doing, to kind of get back to the theory for a little moment, is that basing on these categories of antagonistic, agonistic, cosmopolitan memory, we try to analyze the selected exhibitions, and we ask first about the theoretical assumptions and aims of the people involved in the exhibition making process, and on the other hand we try to check those against our own interpretation of the exhibitions, but also against the perception of the visitors, because we also plan to make a small sample of visitors' studies in all those places. But then you could ask, for what goodness sake is actually an agonistic museum narrative? What are we asking about? There is this quite famous book of Nathan Schneider and Daniel Levy, The Holocaust Memory in Global Age. And there they claim that the globalization, individualization process, the weakening of national identities, also international mobility, and the development, last but not least, the development of new media, led to emergence of something which they call cosmopolitan memory, which means that public memory is not anymore set in what they name container of the nation state, but that memory is becoming, so to say, deterritorialized, yes? And that local events and phenomena are not only commemorated by people directly linked to them. And in fact, as a core example for this cosmopolitan memory, they name the Holocaust, which, as they claim, has become an important icon, well, all over in Europe, but also beyond Europe. And what they say, that this leads to a development of a sort of common patterns of commemoration. So in many European countries, but also beyond, they say we witness the rise of a more self-critical, self-reflexive historical understanding. And this means, amongst others, the abandoning of heroic national narratives and focusing very much on kind of injustices and crimes committed by own whatever national or other community, by us to others. And this also brings about a change of attitude towards a broader public focus on victimhood and a recognition of the other, but not in general the other victim, the others, the victims of our crimes. So, on the other hand, you have many critics of this theory, in the sense that you have that they would first say that in fact nothing such as a cosmopolitan memory is really in sight, that it's just a kind of intellectual construct, and that there is nothing like a European community or even world, but even a European community of experience and memory, and that it would be even bad to try to enforce something like that, to enforce a kind of homogeneous vision on history. And it seems that this skepticism is very much shared also by European citizens. There have been some research made by the same Daniel Levy only a few years later. In 2011, he and his colleagues published an article where they examined, they made group interviews in Germany, Austria, and Poland. Maybe they were not representatives, but those were 60 group interviews in those different countries, asking about issues of European identity and memory. And what they found out was that actually none of these countries people believed in an existence of such a common kind of European historical narrative. Everywhere it was put into question that such narrative even exists. But what they found out is that that despite this, in those 3 different countries, there is a sort of growing awareness that there are other narratives. They all believe there is no one European narrative, but there is a growing awareness that beside our narratives there are other, and a sort of openness or readiness to face those other narratives, or to discuss them and to acknowledge them, or to engage with those different standpoints. Thus, I now quote Daniel Levy, "The great potential of European memory is its capacity to incorporate multiple perspectives and manage this inevitable conflicts of different memory narratives." And this seems to be very near to what Aleida Asman calls a dialogic culture of remembering, what she claims as kind of something one should strive to, and what we would call an agonistic approach to history, whereas I think we stress more this point of irreconcilability of different European historical narratives, which is in this agonistic term. So, basing on these reflections, we have tried to define agonistic, cosmopolitan, and antagonistic museum exhibitions as follows. But I might make a remark. Of course, we consider those as sort of Bavarian ideal type, so we don't think there is any such exhibition which would be whatever, cosmopolitan, agonistic, or antagonistic. But there are different elements of exhibition, and some exhibitions may be more like this, or more agonistic or antagonistic, but they are mostly a mix of it. But what we defined as the kind of most important traits would be for antagonistic exhibitions, that they are based on the manichean division between good, which is us, and them, which is evil, that they have mostly a very heroic and quite non-reflexive or non-critical narrative about own national history, that they are fairly monologic, having one national narrative on history, and that they very much serve to awake passions of belonging and strengthening national identity. Then what we would define as cosmopolitan would be again non-heroic and reflexive towards own, whatever is considered as own history, national or even European, so emphasizing injustice, crimes committed by own community, and aimed at least taking an effort to create a shared transnational historical narrative, and at the same time very often focused very much on victims and their suffering, and again recognizing the history of and memory of the others, but others understood as our victims, not our enemies or rivals, but our victims. And so aiming at awakening empathy and human suffering, and very much future-oriented in the sense that history is treated as a sort of tool or source to strengthen commitment to human rights for the future. And what then we would define as an agonistic approach would be also self-reflexive towards own history, but in a way more dialogic, in that sense that it acknowledged the irreconcilability of different historical perspectives, and it would be multi-perspective and controversial. Here we use the terms used also in German historical pedagogy. They speak about multi-perspectivity and controversität, controversial. The difference is that multi-perspectivity is something which is more from the historical time, so different experiences, different viewpoints on history from that time, how people from that time differently experience history, while controversial approach is more stressing the different contemporary interpretations of history now. And again, the last point would be that those exhibitions are very much, or would very much stress historical agency, but focusing not only on victims, but also on perpetrators, on bystanders, on heroes, however we design them. So they would be not only merely focused on victims. So taking this as a starting point, we want further to examine if and how museums, particularly museums focusing on the both world wars, can enhance the emergence of such agonistic approach to history. And we ask, what do we ask the museums? We ask if the museums we examine really introduce multi-perspectivity and controversiality, although all of them claim that. But if they really do it, and how do those different museums understand this? What perspectives, if they are multi-perspective, what perspectives are taken into account, which are silenced? How do they present perpetrators, victims, bystanders, and heroes? How do they define them? Do they treat all of them? How do they define those different categories? What do they tell about those different groups? How do they tell about them? And what are the museological tools they use to present those different contradicting historical standpoints? And also, are there some ways of exhibiting which would rather enhance or maybe hinder a multi-perspectivic approach? We have seen, even from the pictures, that those are very different exhibitions. For example, Perron exhibition, or it would be a rather documentary exhibition, very much focused on original artifacts, while the exhibition in Krakow, the Schindler's Factory, it's an exhibition which stages history. So they use few original, authentic artifacts, and even those they use, they put them in a sort of theatralic setting and do not focus so much on them. So you have very different museological approaches. Do they help or hinder this multi-perspectival approach? And finally, we also want to speak to the curators and people who did the exhibitions and ask them what are the limits of introducing such a multi-perspectivic, controversial historical approach. So it's not sort of a judging process, but more to learn from the curators really what were their reflections. They wanted to be more perspective, but what did they mean by that? How far were they ready to go? Why did they not do certain things? Or because of the content, but also because it was museologically not possible. Okay, so the last point I come is to the question how we want to proceed, or what do we really want to do. So we have sort of defined 3 research stages. First is the archival and press analysis and interviews with stakeholders, which means with curators, directors of the museum, also politicians which took part in the exhibition, making process, members of the scientific boards and so on. And this is the phase of we are now in. You see the kind of first, whatever, not the results, but some findings from the archives. Then we are doing an exhibition analysis, and so basically there are 5 people working on the different museums, the researchers working on the different places, but we also decided to meet at each of this place once together to kind of streamline the research, but also to get those different perspectives on those museums. And our first visit was to Coverate just last week. And the third, so we will make an analysis, our own analysis of those 3 exhibitions. And the last part is the visitor study. We decided to make 20 semi-structured interviews in each of those museums. We might add to this some other research methods which we are still examining possibilities. It is a qualitative and not quantitative research, but we hope this will give us some feedback. As you already mentioned, there might be big differences how we perceive the exhibitions and how they are perceived by visitors. So we want to have some feedback, not to be in our sort of intellectual tower. Okay, so this is our plan. The final result would be or will be a workshop which we plan for September. September next year. Not a very big workshop, a workshop where we want to invite the representatives of the museums we analyze, but also some external expert museum practitioners. We would be also very happy to have the Ypres Museum on board, and then we would like to present the result of our research and to discuss it. We plan a series of articles, and also we hope that our research result would go into the work of other work packages, especially in the exhibition making process. And this is the end.